Voting rights diversion and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer. We are back in 2022 after being tan, rested, and ready once again. This podcast is called Voting Rights Diversion. And we have, ladies and gentlemen, the dumbest bill probably that we have seen in a long time. As you know, each episode, we have a dumbest bill in America, and it can be from anywhere in the country. It can be from a state legislature, the federal government, a city council, a county. It doesn't matter. We do lots of research on this. This one ranks up there probably towards the top 10 dumbest bills in America. And I'm just going to give you a hint because the dumbest bill is always at the end of our podcast. It has something to do with sitting down. Has something to do with sitting down, has something to do with chairs. But first up, podcast listeners, voting rights diversion. What do you do when you're president of the United States and the economy is faltering? Inflation is spiraling out of control. You just had an increase last week in jobless claims, despite the vast number of jobs that are available in the United States of America. You have energy prices that are through the roof for things that are very basic, like home heating oil, home natural gas, home propane, home electricity, gasoline for your car. Everywhere you look, things are just not going well. You have a border that's out of control. You have some cities and some counties and some states still putting in and adding to mandates for masks or mandating vaccines. And in some cases, mandating vaccine passports. It's unthinkable in a free society like the United States of America. This is what is going on in 2022. This is Joe Biden's America. And so what does he do? He engages in voting rights diversion. Voting rights diversion. That's right. You divert everybody's attention in the country to a new crisis because you don't want the people in the country, naturally, to pay attention to how bad things really are getting throughout the United States, particularly in the blue states, but in many other states as well, just by virtue of the bad policies of the White House and of the Democrats who control the House and the Senate at the federal level. So you have Biden saying, you know what? And of course, his advisors are giving him this advice. We need to manufacture a crisis and talk about that crisis so that we can divert people's attention away from how bad things are. And that's going to be voting rights. We're going to tell people that there are insufficient rights and opportunities to vote in the United States. And as a result, there needs to be federal legislation to codify all of these quote unquote voting rights that have been taken away in red states. I'm speaking from the perspective of the Democrats and the Biden administration. So Biden's advisors are saying, well, then let's create this crisis and tell people that they're going to be denied the opportunity to vote this year in the midterm elections. Some states, of course, have gubernatorial elections as well as local elections and state legislative offices that are up for election. Some states have that as well. So the Biden administration is trying to stir the pot and say, you know what, if we don't pass this federal legislation, you won't be able to vote, for example, in the state of Georgia. Just unbelievable. And in order to pass the voting rights legislation that Biden wants to pass, the great irony is he wants to break the long-standing filibuster rule in the United States Senate. In other words, Biden wants to literally not follow the rules of operating in a democracy. Of course, technically we are a republic, a constitutional republic. He doesn't want to follow those rules because he wants to pass a bill to give Democrats some sort of advantage nationally in elections. So he doesn't want to follow the rules in the Senate, and he's saying that the states aren't following the rules in elections. Kind of interesting approach there. So in the Daily Caller, President Joe Biden called on Democrat leaders to reform Senate rules and even eliminate the filibuster if Republicans continue to block his effort to nationalize election laws Tuesday. Biden's statement is an about-face from his previous support for the filibuster, a rule requiring a 60-vote majority to pass most legislation. Biden in March of 2021 said that he wasn't in favor of abolishing or even reforming the filibuster, a stance the left wing of the Democrat Party has railed against for much of his time in office. Biden traveled to Atlanta, Georgia, to make the announcement Tuesday during a speech alongside Vice President Kamala Harris. I believe, quote, the threat to our democracy is so grave that we must find a way to pass these voting rights bills, to bake them in, vote, and let majority prevail, Biden said. And if that bare minimum is blocked, we have no option but to change the Senate rules, including getting rid of the filibuster. So there you have the President of the United States who's speaking in Georgia, trying to create a new crisis, and also literally not understanding the foundational principles of our constitutional republic, because he says he wants to let us vote and let the majority prevail. Well, he's referring to the filibuster in the Senate, and he's losing perspective of why the Senate operates that way. The Senate operates the way it does with the filibuster so that you have a consensus among 60 members in the Senate. Because when you pass laws at the federal level, they are usually pretty important laws. They tend to affect many, many people. And so the 60 vote threshold requires United States senators to actually work together. They're forced to work together. They may absolutely despise one another in certain circumstances and on certain policy preferences, but they are forced to work together. And that is a good thing. That is a good thing. And so Biden is like, well, it's not a republic, No. The majority must always prevail. And of course, the founding fathers in the Federalist Papers warned us about what happens when you have runaway majorities, namely, you get tyranny, right? That's why you have a republic. That's why we have states' rights in voting and in deciding how elections are run. That's why we haven't had a federalized voting system. So Biden's election bills, the Freedom to Vote Act and John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, would nationalize federal election laws by allowing the Department of Justice to strike down state-level election procedures if it deems them to be discriminatory. Biden touted that the DOJ could take such action even before state-level policies go into effect. Critics argue the bills are a subversion of the Constitution, which requires the federal government to defer to each state's voting laws, meaning that the state's voting laws take precedence. Biden argued that Georgia's recently passed election law is a prime example of one that the DOJ would love to strike down, calling the law Jim Crow 2.0. Republican critics have pointed out, however, that Biden's home state of Delaware has more restrictive voting laws than those that the Georgia bill imposes. So first of all, this really is not necessarily a very well-written paragraph in the Daily Caller, because in Georgia, I think there are 17 days of early voting. 17 days of early voting. If you can't get your butt to the polls and vote on those 17 days, then obviously you really didn't want to vote. In addition, in Georgia, you have to request a ballot that is absentee if you want an absentee ballot. Additionally, in Georgia, they're not going to mail out mass ballots. And that's what the Democrats want. Also in Georgia, they don't allow ballot harvesting, but the Democrats want ballot harvesting at the federal level. And, of course, last but not least among this list, the Democrats don't want voter ID, and Georgia has strong voter ID laws, namely that you must show a valid ID in order to demonstrate that you are a resident of Georgia and that you are who you say you are and that you are the person who is actually voting on that particular ballot. Makes perfect sense, okay? Democrats don't want any of that. So Biden says that's Jim Crow 2.0. So podcast listeners, here's the thing. When you have a president of the United States that says terms like Jim Crow 2.0, he's literally stirring the pot so much and creating racial division intentionally and doing so in an incredibly dishonest way. This is not the 1960s, ladies and gentlemen. This is not the 1950s. This is 2021. And every American citizen who has registered to vote can vote. And the purpose of the registration process in states to vote is so that the states know that you're actually living in that state and that you provide an address of where you actually are located to demonstrate that you are actually living in that state and that you are actually 18 years of age or older. That's its purpose. So it's a good purpose. And given the millions of people that Biden is allowing to cross the border illegally, it's more important than ever that the states run the elections and at the same time decide to administer them as they so choose and require registration and voter ID. Unfortunately, there are plenty of states that don't require voter ID. My state's one of them, the state of Maryland. We don't require voter ID. The state of Maryland allows ballot harvesting under certain circumstances, and the state of Maryland does everything it can to skew elections in favor of the Democrat Party. Even though that is the case, and even though that is wrong, federalizing elections is a terrible idea. Okay, because in our state, just like in all of the other 49 states, individuals can throw out their elected officials if they want to when they're unhappy. And I am convinced that at some point in some of these blue states, you're going to have complete economic collapses, in which case people are going to wake up one day and go, you know what? I was voting Democrat my whole life. I'm a progressive, but finally I'm going to just vote for the other guy, the other party, because things couldn't get any worse. It's exactly what's going to happen. So Biden tied the decision to his administration's effort to Democrat election bills, arguing that Republicans and former President Donald Trump are working to subvert democracy. Says the guy who wants to have a federal takeover of elections. It's the Republicans that want to subvert democracy. Biden says Trump only failed to overturn the results of the 2020 election thanks to the local election officials, individuals he argues may be replaced with Trump loyalists by the next election. Can you imagine a president of the United States speaking in this way? And it demonstrates to you why they are so desperate and what they are willing to do, just like what they were willing to do in 2020 with the mass mail-out balloting. Democrat West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin remains a key obstacle for Biden's legislation. However, stating Tuesday that he is still opposed to repealing the filibuster. He has also expressed skepticism of the voting rights legislation in its current form. With a 50-50 Senate, Manchin's vote could tank the legislation even without the filibuster. We need some good rule changes to make the place work better, but getting rid of the filibuster doesn't make the place work better, Manchin told reporters Tuesday. And that's because Manchin knows that when you have a filibuster that requires 60 members, then you have 60 members, namely a combination of both parties working together to try to craft legislation that is hopefully constitutional and that makes sense. Manchin has stated that any reforms to Senate rules should have a 2/3 majority, requiring 17 Republican senators to agree with the changes. Bingo. That's really, really important, podcast listeners, because at least Manchin is taking a principled approach to this. Namely, that, hey, if you want to change the rules of the filibuster, which requires 60 votes, then you should have 2/3 of the 100 members agree to it. Because that's how we got here to begin with, and we put this in place for good reason. And so also, the Biden administration is pivoting to this voting rights legislation and doing everything that it can to create a diversion, because according to the Gateway Pundit, they have this titled article, "It's Coming, Biden's Latest Irrational Moves Obliterate the U.S. Economy," about 2 weeks out. So I don't know about that, but I'm going to read it anyway. So it says, of course, this is not making headlines, but in the next 2 weeks, Joe Biden is planning on shutting down a significant portion of the trade pipeline with Canada. According to government figures, U.S. goods and services trade with Canada totaled an estimated $718.4 billion in 2019. Exports were $360.4 billion. Imports were $358 billion. Canada was the largest goods export market in 2019. Canada was the United States' third largest supplier of goods and imports in 2019. U.S. good imports from Canada totaled $319.4 billion. 70% of that trade is moved by truck. In about a week, the Joe Biden vaccine mandate will mean about 30,000 cross-border truckers will be forced to shut down. Again, in about a week, Biden's vaccine mandate will cause 30,000 cross-border truckers to be shut down. That's because they don't want to get the vaccine. They don't want to be mandated to get the vaccine. Some may even have the vaccine, but they don't want to be mandated. Starting January the 15th, truckers will be forced to show proof of a vaccination. So think about this. We have a supply chain and inflation crisis. In about a week, the vaccine mandate and subsequent commercial passport for the vaccine means 30,000 cross-border truckers are about to get shut down from operating between the United States and Canada. And when you look at the vast amount of trade that these two countries engage in, you say to yourself, what is this administration trying to do? What are they trying to achieve? Are they really trying to achieve 100% vaccinations, or, which of course is none of their damn business, or are they trying to achieve something else? Are they trying to collapse the economy? Are they trying to collapse the middle class? Are they trying to institute some sort of passport system that will also put into place a kind of social credit score system such as that which they have in China? And so all of this really makes you wonder, and I know podcast listeners, you're reading a lot of this stuff too, and you're wondering the same thing. And then Nancy Pelosi announces that the State of the Union won't be at the beginning of the year. Instead, it'll be in March. So Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi formally invited President Joe Biden Friday to give his State of the Union address on March 1, the latest date ever announced for the annual speech. It's because Biden has nothing to say that would be of use to the American people to make them feel confident in his leadership, obviously. During the address, Biden will likely promote the two most important unfinished parts of his first term agenda, the Build Back Broke social spending package and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. I like how they put John Lewis ahead of that. Advancement Act. Presidents are expected to deliver an address to a joint session of Congress every year, although the speech is not considered the State of the Union until the president's second year in office. Biden addressed a joint session of Congress on April 28, 2021, during which he advocated for gun control and his American Jobs and Families plans. Quote, "Thank you for your bold vision and patriotic leadership, which have guided America out of crisis and into an era of great progress, as we not only recover from the pandemic, but build back better," Pelosi wrote in the invitation. Quote, "Indeed, this past year has been historic, with life-saving American Rescue Plan, once-in-a-century bipartisan infrastructure law, and soon the truly transformational Build Back Better Act. And of course, she just goes on and writes all this nonsense. But why do you think, podcast listeners, that it's March 1? It's March 1 because they're hoping by some miracle that between now and March 1st, something in the U.S. economy will get better. Yet Joe Biden wants to shut down the border with Canada by requiring every single trucker to have a passport, not a passport to go from one country to another, like the kind that you get from the State Department, but an entirely different passport that's in addition to that says and proves that you have been vaccinated, that you've been vaccinated, that it's not your choice, that your medical choices are no longer yours, that in a free society, in our republic, that you no longer have the choice to make these kinds of decisions. In fact, not only do you not have that choice, but you don't even have a choice to have a job. Incredible. And so here's another one. In the Daily Wire, oil prices are expected to soar in 2022. Here's why. In the Daily Wire, oil prices will hit $100 per barrel in 2022, according to Goldman Sachs. In a recent note, the investment bank pointed to robust fundamentals in the oil market and a surprisingly large oil supply deficit, according to a report from CNN Business. Nevertheless, Goldman Sachs pointed to a long-term reluctance to invest in oil during the energy transition. Between November 2020 and November 2021, the average cost of gas increased from $2.01 to $3.40 per gallon in the United States. However, President Joe Biden's allies have been emphasizing the smallest available signs of momentary cost decreases. For instance, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee shared a graph on Twitter boasting about a 2-cent decline in gas prices, while CNN host Don Lemon recently celebrated the fact that gas prices fell by roughly 9 cents from the previous month. Can you imagine? It's like, yeah, they're up to $3.40, but they're down by 9 cents. Now, isn't that just misleading a little bit? Yeah, they were $2 and now they're $3.40 a gallon, but they're down 9 cents. No, they're actually still $3 and what? 31 cents a gallon or $3.32 a gallon. A big economic relief for millions of Americans who have been dealing with soaring energy prices, Lemon said on his program that they dropped by 9 cents. Cost at the pump finally easing up with the national average of a gallon. So when you hear somebody like Don Lemon, when you hear them on CNN and they're talking in this way, you know that you're almost back in the 1980s and watching the Soviet channels. You had all of the different Soviet channels. I think there were one or two of them, at least in the Soviet Union. And they would always say the same thing. There is plenty of wheat this year. There's a record harvest. Get ready for all the bread that's going to be available in all of the state-owned stores. And they would say this again and again and again. And then you would go to the state-owned store and there was a line of 200 people. And by the time you got into the store, there was no bread. Literally, that's what happened. But if you watched the TV, everything was great. It was fantastic. That's CNN. That's CNN in modern America. Quote, a big economic relief for millions of Americans who have been dealing with soaring energy prices. Lemon said on his program, cost at the pump finally easing up, with the national average up for a gallon of regular falling to $3.35, the lowest since October. Just look at that. Yeah, the lowest since October, but still $1.50 more than when Trump was in office. At one point, the Biden administration attempted to address high gas prices by tapping 50 million barrels of oil from the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve. According to the United States Energy Information Administration, however, The United States consumed roughly 18 million barrels of petroleum per day in 2020, meaning that the release only amounted to 2.5 days worth of consumption. Meanwhile, BlackRock chief executive Larry Fink called on policymakers to create a green economy that is fair and just by fostering access to renewable energy sources, as highlighted by CNN Business. He said that any plan only designed to cut the supply of fossil fuels instead of increasing demand for green energy will drive up energy prices for those who can least afford it, resulting in greater polarization around climate change and eroding progress. I want to read that again. BlackRock chief executive Larry Fink said that any plan only designed to cut the supply of fossil fuels instead of increasing demand for green energy will drive up energy prices. No, that's actually not true. If you cut fossil fuel supply, obviously price is going to go up. So that part is true. But what he's saying is that we should automatically go to green energy. In other words, electric cars. That's what he's talking about. Let's all face it. And why do you suppose BlackRock chief Larry Fink would say such a thing? He would say such a thing because it is his goal to make tens of billions of dollars with the infrastructure bill that Biden just passed, that has billions and billions and billions of dollars in the infrastructure bill for green energy, so that good old crony capitalists like Mr. Fink of BlackRock can go and take advantage of all of these government programs because he's connected to the right people. He's connected to the right people, namely the Biden administration. Meanwhile, your gas prices and your energy prices for your home and for your vehicles continue to go up. And by the way, so does everything else, because everything else requires energy in order to make, in order to grow. But these people don't care. As long as they get rich, as long as your taxes go up and inflation goes up for you, but they're not affected very much, are they? They're not affected because they're part of the food chain coming right out of the White House. And of course, Nancy Pelosi's Congress as well. And also in Gateway Pundit podcast listeners, Joe Biden erects a concrete security wall around the White House. Meanwhile, the border is wide open. Why do you suppose this is the case? Well, the Biden administration built a concrete security wall around the White House this week. It is not clear yet why they believe the construction of the concrete wall is necessary. You should see this thing. They look like gravestones, but much thicker and taller, in front of the people's house. And of course, certainly makes you wonder. And you look down at this and you see the fact that, well, I guess maybe it's because we're kind of approaching a period of time when the Biden administration feels that there are so many people that are against their policies and how they are collapsing our economy that maybe they're concerned. I don't know. I don't know if that is true or not. But here is the thing, ladies and gentlemen. When your government is causing inflation, when your government is trying to stop you from heating your house and putting gasoline in your car by shutting down all the supply, when you have a supply chain crisis that even includes food in a nation that has farms so massive across the continent that we feed the world, and yet you go to your local grocery store and there isn't sufficient food in some cases. Depends on the type of food so far. When you have a government that has a border that is wide open, doesn't test anyone as they cross it, doesn't care to try to monitor the border, but is telling you you need a passport in order to travel inside of restaurants or other private businesses, and the passport it has to do with a vaccine, but you're not requiring the same thing of the people crossing the border who don't belong here to begin with because they're coming in illegally. And at the same time, you're putting a wall around the White House. It is no wonder you have a population in the United States that is probably getting closer and closer to the boiling point. And the Democrats, ladies and gentlemen, are messing with fire on this. They're messing with fire because the fire is the American people. And the American people know that their government doesn't care about them anymore because of what it's doing to them, how it is collapsing the middle class and doing so intentionally, and putting people out of work by having the government try to make your healthcare decision for you and mandating it. The government, in other words, that is currently being run by the Democrat Party is engaging, in my opinion, in an insurrection against the American people. An insurrection against the American people. And the Democrat Party, which is engaging in an insurrection against the American people, is trying to collapse the middle class and trying to do so intentionally because they are so incredibly blinded by their religion of progressivism. So next up, podcast listeners, the new governor of Virginia is inaugurated. That's right. Ralph Northam is no longer around. And Governor Youngkin is back. He's there. Pretty cool stuff. But rather than tell you about Governor Youngkin, I was initially going to have a clip on some of the things that he said. And you can imagine, Youngkin spent much of his inauguration speech in Virginia as Virginia's new governor, talking about the public school system, the need for parents to take it back, and how he was going to help parents take it back. So that's good stuff, right? These are things that we should be talking about nationwide as conservatives, about how parents need to take back public schools, how we need to have school choice and educational freedom, and lastly, how the only people that are supposed to be raising the kids and the only people that are ultimately truly responsible for raising children are the parents, because kids belong to the parents. Kids don't belong to the state. But right before Glenn Youngkin, the new governor of Virginia, was inaugurated, Governor Ralph Northam, the old governor, pardoned a Democrat state senator who was jailed for underage sex crimes. So good old blackface Northam, right before he was ready to exit the governor's mansion, pardons a Democrat state senator who had been actually jailed for sex crimes. In other words, having sex with an underage individual. So Governor Blackface Klansman Ralph Northam pardoned a Democrat who was jailed for underage sex crimes in his final act as Virginia governor. Northam pardoned Democrat State Senator Joe Morrissey, who was charged for having a sexual relationship with his 17-year-old law firm receptionist. Now, first of all, podcast listeners, a law firm, right? The guy's a lawyer. He has a law firm. Someone comes in and applies, and you're going to hire a 17-year-old woman as your receptionist? I mean, why not just wait until the individual's an adult? Wouldn't you always hire an adult as your receptionist? I mean, if you walked into a law firm and you have a receptionist who is a woman, and a receptionist is an important job because they do a lot of the work for the lawyer. You know, they type a lot of briefs, they take messages, they're constantly emailing. I mean, it's an important job, okay? It is. And you walked in and you saw a 15-year-old girl, it would probably say, why is there someone not as an adult working here? Isn't this kind of weird? But Morrissey clearly knew he was hiring an underage woman in his law firm as his assistant. And he ultimately married her once she turned 18, and they now have 4 children. So I guess good old Ralph Northam, He probably should have pardoned himself for that picture that was taken of him in blackface. Or was he the Klansman, Chris? I'm not really sure. Which one was he? Was he the Klansman with the big pointy white hat? Yeah, or was he in black? It's very hard to tell because the blackface that he used in this picture was like so incredibly like, charcoal black that he had put on his face that you really can't tell. And it appears, although I can't tell, it appears that he may be wearing sunglasses or something in that picture as well. So therefore you really can't see his eyes, but I guarantee you somebody knows. So maybe he should have just pardoned himself. He should have just pardoned himself. And this is what good old creepy Ralph Northam does right before he leaves. And isn't it incredible, a Democrat, right? Democrats who seem to now be the party of pedophilia. I really do believe that. And also, they're the party of Ralph Northam, where they refuse to call out a member of their own party who engaged in this kind of behavior, not as a child, but as an adult in college. I mean, unbelievable. Would you in your right mind ever think that that person could have ever survived being the governor of Virginia? Somehow he survived, somehow. Not really sure how that ever happened, but nonetheless, he did survive. So next up, podcast listeners, we have a go woke or go broke. That's right. Get this, podcast listeners. In the Daily Caller, Woke Inc., Woke Incorporated, is now a multi-billion-dollar business in America. And it has some Democrats scared. An outpouring of grants to activist groups promoting race-based ideology is causing problems for some Democrats by highlighting the most unpopular beliefs of party members. At least that's according to an op-ed published in the New York Times. Charitable support for racial equity projects skyrocketed after the death of George Floyd in June of 2020. These projects received $3.3 billion from 2011 to 2019, then $12.7 billion and $11.6 billion in 2020 and 2021, respectively, according to the New York Times op-ed. Racial equity-related grants support initiatives ranging from support for historically black colleges to campaigns to dismantle municipal police forces, according to the piece. These grants also support so-called anti-racist research, which favors discriminatory policies against non-black individuals in order to diminish unequal outcomes between racial groups. Quote, when progressive philanthropists fund groups that promote extreme views like defunding the police or that sanction cancel culture, they are exacerbating intra-party conflict and fueling backlash from Republicans, Matt Bennett, senior vice president of think tank Third Way, reportedly said. Among Democrats, black and Hispanic voters were more likely than white voters to favor increases in police budgets. In 2021, according to the Pew Research Center, Bennett reportedly pointed out that a failed defund the police ballot initiative in Minneapolis performed worse in the city's most heavily black districts. But this doesn't escape me that the woke movement, known as Woke Incorporated, which is why this is one of our Go Woke or Go Broke segments in this podcast, is a multi-billion-dollar business. Because you have the consultants that engage in race-based ideology and training, little communist members going out there and little Communist Party members and going out there and making sure they train teachers and union members and others so that they can completely brainwash the new generation and the younger generation. And it's in the billions of dollars. And where does the money come from? Well, the money comes from, in large part, from the taxpayers, because states and local governments mandate that this race-based ideology and racial equity be taught. And in addition to that, it's coming from the big corporations, many of whom give directly to these race-based organizations. It's literally unbelievable. I mean, unbelievable that these individuals get so many billions of dollars. And you say to yourself, wait a minute. You're putting money into organizations that divide people by the way they look. And the answer is, yep, that's pretty much what they're doing. So podcast listeners, here's the thing. Woke Inc. is real. And it's definitely here to stay, at least for a while, at least until state legislators and state legislation is put into place to stop this crazy stuff. And at least by stop, I mean to halt the use of taxpayer dollars to fund it, which is unthinkable, right? Because it's antithetical to the Constitution of the United States, yet taxpayer dollars are being used to tell people that they should decide on who people really are based solely on the way they look. And also in Go Broke, or Go Woke or Go Broke, we have a news story that Rand Paul decides to cancel his DirecTV because DirecTV canceled OANN. So it's a double cancel culture there. And this is also in the Daily Wire. So Senator Rand Paul, he's a Republican from Kentucky, is canceled or has canceled his home DirecTV membership over the television provider's cancellation of the right-wing news channel One America News, otherwise known as OANN. Paul announced on Twitter Monday that he was ditching DirecTV and because they canceled OAN. So he said, you know what? I'm just going to cancel my DirecTV then. Why give money to people who hate us? Paul said. He tweeted that out. DirecTV, one of the largest U.S. pay TV providers, announced this week that it intended to drop OANN from its lineup, deciding not to renew its contract with OANN's parent company, Herring Networks Incorporated. DirecTV is also dropping Herring's other channel, AWE, a lifestyle channel. There you go, right? A lifestyle channel that's based on, family values. Oh, we can't have that. Quote, we informed Herring Networks that following a routine internal review, we do not plan to enter into a new contract when our current agreement expires, DirecTV said in a statement to Bloomberg on Friday. DirecTV's decision to cut OANN comes as Democrat lawmakers have ramped up pressure on cable television providers to cut down on misinformation being spread over the airwaves. Last month, President Joe Biden scolded cable companies and social media platforms for hosting purveyors of lies and misinformation. Yes, you cannot talk about the inflation. That's a lie. Prices aren't going up, says Joe Biden. That was me, not the article. In a December 21 address from the White House, Biden attacked the companies and claimed they were contributing to vaccine misinformation and endangering lives. Oh, there you go again. So you see, in the United States of America in the 21st century, all you need to say is, you're engaging in vaccine misinformation, and therefore you're going to get canceled. Quote, again, for folks who are not vaccinated, you may think you're putting only yourself at risk, but it's your choice. Your choice is not just a choice about you, it affects other people. You are putting other people at risk. That's not true, by the way. Your loved ones, your friends, neighbors, strangers you run into, and your choice can be the difference between life or death, Biden claimed. The longer the virus is around, the more likely variants form, and they may be deadlier than the ones that have come before. Highly unlikely. Quote, let me say again and again and again, please get vaccinated. It's the only responsible thing to do, said Biden. Those who are not vaccinated are causing hospitals to become overrun again, he continued. He went on to credit former President Donald Trump for overseeing the creation of several vaccines against COVID-19. Oh, yeah, sure. Like he's actually going to credit Trump for anything. Thanks to the prior administration and our scientific community, America was one of the first countries to get the vaccine. Thanks to my administration and the hard work of Americans, we led a rollout and made America among the world leaders in getting shots in the arms, Biden said. The president then called on cable and social media companies to crack down on dangerous misinformation being spread on their platforms. And that is what caused OANN to get canceled, or at the very least, that gave DirecTV an excuse to cancel OANN on the DirecTV platform. So you can't see OANN anymore on DirecTV. That's the moral of the story. But the other moral of the story is much deeper. Namely, you have the President of the United States that issues an edict. And the edict is, you can't have any alternative opinions or networks out there. That's not allowed. So I want media companies to crack down on dangerous misinformation as he defines it. That's exactly what the Founding Fathers didn't want. They didn't want an imperial presidency. The Founding Fathers did not want an imperial presidency. They didn't want a president to develop into a king-like figure that could crack down on free speech, including speech that he doesn't like. That's the whole point of our republic. You get to say what you want, including the stuff that others don't like. That's just the way it is. And nothing has changed between the pre-social media era and the post and current social media era, namely that you get to say what you want. It's just the way it is. And this is so dangerous, but Rand Paul at least is making people aware of the fact that this is happening with DirecTV and other media companies and social media companies. And so Rand Paul's like, okay, fine, then I'll just cancel DirecTV. And for all of you out there that don't know this already, DirecTV, you get your TV from a satellite versus from, an actual cable running to your house. And DirecTV is already losing plenty of customers anyway, because people are going to fiber and to cable for broadband, and they don't want satellite TV because it's just so daggone slow. And it also, by slow, I mean your internet through satellite is incredibly slow. Not to mention that if you have satellite TV like DirecTV or Dish Network, you also have the issue of outages whenever it rains and you have extreme cloud cover or a snowstorm. You don't get TV because the satellite can't see your dish. So there's that. And they're already losing customers because of that, because as people determine that that is the case and they finally start getting alternatives through broadband initiatives around in the state, well, then eventually you can actually get cable or fiber. And then the first thing they do is cancel DirecTV or cancel Dish Network. But good for you, Rand Paul, for making a stand. And I mean that. Good for you, Rand Paul. So next up, podcast listeners, we have the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up, Mr. Producer? Of course. Here it is. Dum 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 dum. And it's the dumbest bill in America. And it is, you ready? The right to sit. The right to sit. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the name of this legislation. I did not make that up. Montgomery County State Delegate, he is a Maryland State Delegate, Vaughn Stewart, who represents a county called Montgomery County. Talk about a woke county, woke Inc. there. Montgomery County State Delegate, or Maryland State Delegate, Vaughn Stewart, put in a piece of legislation known as House Bill 258, entitled Employment Standards, Seating for Employees, the Right to Sit Act of 2022. The Right to Sit Act of 2022. So podcast listeners, are you ready for this? And this happens to do with employers, right? And employees. An employer that employs 15 or more employees shall provide a suitable seat for an employee if the nature of the work that the employee performs can reasonably be performed while seated. And for a newly constructed facility, or as part of a major renovation, may not design a workspace that requires an employee to stand while performing work if the workspace could reasonably be designed to allow the work to be performed while seated. That's right. So if you're an employee and you're a bartender, you have the right to sit. If you're an employee and you're a waiter, you have the right to sit. So how does that work? I guess you have a stool. Are stools allowed? Or is it chairs only? So what is it? Your stool has like wheels on it, and then you like sit and you like push yourself around the entire restaurant and say, "Hi, may I help you?" while you're sitting down, and you sit down at the table with them. Or can umpires have seats? In a baseball game, he just puts a seat down and sits down and says, this is a reasonable accommodation as an umpire. So an employer that employs 14 or less employees shall provide a suitable seat for each employee who requests a seat if the nature of the work that the employee performs can be performed while seated. Folks, I'm reading this from the bill. This is literally from the bill, the Right to Sit Act. It is a broad-brushed bill that says no matter the employer, no matter what you do, no matter what the nature of your job is, it's not that you have a right to a break. That's not what this bill is. The bill is you have a right to sit down the whole time you're doing the job. Talk about sitting down on the job, right? I thought that was considered a bad thing. Well, when you're a little socialist like this delegate, ladies and gentlemen, Delegate Vaughn Stewart, a Maryland state delegate, is an avowed socialist. When you're an avowed socialist, you're all about sitting down on the job because you don't think people should have to work anyway. Because under true socialism and Marxism, they're one and the same. The whole idea is that you get to work as little as you want. Each person should work according to their ability and take according to their need, according to Karl Marx. And apparently, according to Vaughn Stewart, each person should have as many chairs as they want and they can sit down on the job. So that's not all. Wait, that's not it. There's more. So if an employer is really bad and he doesn't let you sit down on the job, I don't mean take a break. I mean just like sit down on the job the whole time. The initial violation is $100. And a subsequent violation is $200. On written request, an employee who is entitled to bring an action under this bill may take an assignment of the claim and trust for the employee, ask the Attorney General to bring an action as well, and may consolidate a bunch of actions to do a class action lawsuit against the employer. You know what? I have a right to sit all the time on the job, all the time. So I was thinking about this, podcast listeners, and I'm thinking this is like canceling standing, right? It's like cancel culture in reverse, I'm canceling standing on the job. No standing allowed. And you're going to get a seat. You can call Mike Lindell for, a My Pillow seat cushion. Perhaps you can do that. And I also thought of the movie Office Space. Have you all seen that movie Office Space? That's the movie where the incredibly annoying boss just walks around with a cup of coffee all the time, is going, I'm going to need those TPS reports, and he just like the ultimate worst in jobs where it's so administrative and boring. It just kills your soul. And there's this character in Office Space, his name's Milton, and he wants his stapler back because his boss took his stapler, wouldn't allow him to have a stapler. I mean, Milton wasn't doing anything wrong with the stapler. He just needs a stapler. So maybe we should have a right to a stapler act. Right to Sit Act, Right to a Stapler Act, Right to a Massage Act on the job. While you're sitting down, you need to have a massage, Hey, employers, $100 for each violation for not giving your employees a massage while they're sitting down on the job. We have a short clip of Milton from Office Space. You'll recall this, and we're just doing this to show you how stupid this bill is that Delegate Vaughn Stewart of the state of Maryland put in, the Right to Sit Act. But first, here's Milton from Office Space. We have the clip. Here it is.
Hi, Milton. What's happening? Milton, we're going to need to go ahead and move you downstairs into storage B.
No,
we
I was told I could
have some
not.
new people coming in, and we need all the space we can get.
But there's no space.
So if you could just go ahead and pack up your stuff and move it down there, that would be terrific.
I was told
okay?
I could stay. Excuse me. I believe you have my stapler.
So there you go. That's from Office Space. And, Milton just wants a stapler. So we should have a Right to Staple Act. And we should have a right to not have to move your office act. And then if you're on an assembly line, right, there are certainly tens of thousands of people in the United States that are on assembly lines of different types. Right to Sit Act. It doesn't matter that your job requires you to stand and that you knew that when you applied for it. You should have a right to sit down on the job. And this, folks, tells you how out of control so many politicians are across the country. They're out of control because they run out of bills to put in that are truly meaningful and that are truly helping advance our society. I mean, the idea, ladies and gentlemen, is this. As an elected official, you are supposed to not put in hardly any bills. The whole idea is to leave people alone so they can live their lives. And this guy just hates employees. He hates employers. He just hates employers. That's really what this comes down to. He thinks employers are bad because he's a socialist. He doesn't think that anyone should be self-employed or anyone should have a company that they own. There shouldn't be owners of companies. Classic Marxist. We should all own the companies together. We should all be able to sit down and, you want to go out there and buy yourself a new car. That's fine, even if you're sitting down on the job. And this is how incredibly stupid things are getting in the legislatures and by politicians across America. And certainly, Delegate Vaughn Stewart does not disappoint with this week's dumbest bill in America, the right to sit. It's a fundamental human right. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. That's the dumbest bill in America. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.